I'm someone who came really just at the end of the Apollo program.
Oh, yeah.
So when Apollo ended, of course, it was very striking to me. It's like, well, wait a minute, I thought we were still going on and doing more things.
Right.
Why is this sort of ending? And through the 70s, there was actually, in rethinking about what are we doing in human spaceflight, there was a recasting of it from, well, we're doing this to beat the Soviets or to demonstrate something, to thinking about space as some place where people would live and would work, and where it would be an area of human activity, of economic activity. And if you looked at what was happening in the NASA side and what was happening in the defense side, you saw these very big government programs all going and doing their thing, whether for science or military purposes, but they were very much large bureaucracies. And so if you wanted something to be innovative, you really couldn't do that within those bureaucracies. You need to find a way to create a third force in that option. And so the idea of commercial space was very striking. So the idea of commercial space married the desire to have space exploration and development continue, not driven solely just by politics, and providing an emphasis for innovation that was different than what the civil or military communities would do. And that in doing that, however, you had to solve a number of problems, not just technical problems or even economic problems, but you also had to have solved policy problems, because you had conflicts over dual-use technologies. So the same technologies they would use for expanding commercial space, launch vehicles, high-resolution remote sensing satellite systems, navigation devices, all these things, of course, have military applications. Right. So as I started sort of peeling back, what were the root issues that had to be done? If I want to go do more things in space, I think that can be promoted by more commercial activities. Yes. I then have to work on, well, what are the underlying policy, legal, and regulatory structures and incentives that would allow for that innovation, would promote that innovation, and make it happen. And so that's what's really, led me down. It was what led me to be at the Commerce Office in the post-Cold War period. It's what led me to be part of efforts at NASA, and led me to sort of what I'm doing now. The job of the Space Council is not to do the work of NASA or DoD or industry, God forbid, but it's to see that those different policies are aligned toward larger national interests, yes, and that they become mutually reinforcing with each other. So I went from being a reasonably competent but not stellar applied physics person to someone where I'm going like, no, I'm actually better at bringing together and communicating across these different cultures, yes, to produce something else.
I would say creating context for this rich market that we have today to come.
How is it creative?
Creating context, meaning you're setting it up.
Yeah.
Because you saw what was happening in DoD, you saw what was happening at NASA, right, and you set the tone and the context for these forces to come together and create a whole new industry. And I mean, just looking back on it, I think the crudeness of Landsat, it's still a massive program, but the crudeness of that compared to the high-resolution commercial imagery that we have today, sort of built on that NASA invention, fused with what was happening in the Intel and DoD space. This required orchestration, I guess, creating context at a policy level to make it come into being. This is amazing to me.
So I think it also means knowing what not to do. One of the things that happened, and of course I probably know some of the GPS world a little bit better, when the U.S. had I think a very fundamentally great idea, almost by accident with GPS, where it provides a signal out there. The U.S. didn't try to add more value to it. They didn't try to create more service on top of it. The signal was there to serve a military function. And since it was a one-way broadcast signal for military purposes, you didn't want to have a two-way connection. So essentially the marginal cost of an additional user was zero. So the price optimally would be zero. And so it already paid for itself, of course, because of its military function. So then making it freely available broadly, because doing anything else would have been actually more difficult. That then allowed the community to go off at Trimble Navigation, and of course I see some folks here from that, was a pioneer in adding value. So the industrial policy, if you will, of the U.S. creating the basic signal but making sure that industry really innovated was a very, very great balance. There wasn't a national PNT service agency created as a utility to provide services via some regulated structure. They really let the market do that and drive that. So if you look today at which areas are probably the least innovative, I hope I'm not going to insult anybody, here, areas like military receivers, things like aviation receivers, those areas which are already heavily regulated for all kinds of national security and public safety purposes, really advance the least. Those areas which are open to competition, and sometimes, you know, really brutal global competition, are the ones that have innovated the fastest, where you have not created a regulatory safe haven, if you will. The remote sensing business is a little bit stranger because coming from the aircraft side, it would have evolved, I think, along with, as we're seeing with drones today, would have evolved maybe in the same direction. But because remote sensing had a history in reconnaissance satellites, people conceived of it as a military technology, you know, from the beginning, rather than an information technology. You know, we didn't go through a national security review to decide about Facebook and Google and all these other sorts of things, okay, but information technology that is derived from this earlier military technology made us struggle a little bit more in the early Cold War period. But again, this is where the remote sensing community then hooked onto the tidal wave of IT going on and didn't try to think of itself as a space technology, but thought of itself as an information technology. And you're just seeing more of that today, of course, with AI and machine learning and so forth. So both GPS and remote sensing have ridden this IT wave. And again, the government has stayed out of it, has not tried to do it. It has just said, here are some basic licensing, here are some basic rules, go forth and have a good time. So I think knowing what not to do is also just as important.
Well, these forces, actually the forces of the people here in the room, in my view, are working sort of collaboratively to create what I would call a instrumented planet, a kind of nervous system of the planet or of the Earth. And so when I say what's next, when I think about what's next, I mean, do you guys think about what's next? Isn't it interesting as a thought? I mean, when I ask that question, when I say what's next, what comes up for you? You know, what's next for me personally? What's next in my career? What's next in my organization? What's next in my community? What's next in my state? What's next for my country? What's next for the world? And at those different levels, there's innovation pushing what's next, but there's also, by necessity, a kind of governing policy framework for thinking about what's next. And your life has really been about being able to find the balance between innovation and government policy, as I'm making it up here. But thinking forward, I'd really like your thoughts about what's next, I guess, in your view of the way the nervous system goes into place.
Right.
And then also what's next in terms of those policy challenges of security, privacy, national security, global security, environmental security, climate change, all of that. What's next in your view that needs to be?
The biggest issue is, it's continued to be this issue, but it's going to become even more acute, is the issue of trust. That is, GPS has done well because we've trusted the signal and it's shown to be reliable. Remote sensing has done well. Geospatial systems largely have done well because of trust. But lack of trust, either at a political level or at a social and economic level, is, I think, pretty much a crisis for some parts of the IT community.
Yes.
The issue of cybersecurity and threats, which of course we have international problems. We're working on issues of cybersecurity principles for space systems because, once you have a space system up there, you can't really go up and touch it. That will change. We will be able to do servicing, but right now it's still a little remote. So how we operate in a world of varying levels of trust, zero trust, whatever, that I think the times when people thought fairly sort of naively that, well, innovation is always good, and if we develop something new, it'll all be good, and it won't be used for evil. That's kind of gone. And so how we live in this more, on one hand, more transparent world, but also one of lack of trust.
Yes.
And how we create that trust and confidence. Now, some people will turn toward authority. They'll say, well, I want something that's service, that's regulated and certified and has a stamp on it. Well, then how do you trust the custodians who do that? And so thinking about how this community maintains and keeps the trust not only of its customers, but also in working with the government to think about what the government's problems are in these areas. And yes, there's some cultural baggage and things that go on, but I've seen examples of collaboration where both sides have built trust, common areas, but that has to be continually nurtured.
Yeah, look, ladies and gentlemen, collaboration, which we need more of today in today's world, don't you agree? Happens at the speed of trust. And what Scott is talking about is how do we build, both at the policy level and also in the technical sphere, those things that help us trust each other. Do you trust me?
Sure.
Yes and no. I mean, we all have interpersonal trust things, but as we spread out, we need to reinforce trust agreements so we feel safe. And this is what's led to war, it's led to social conflict, it's led to lots of the evils that are emerging with the human footprint on the planet today. And what you're really addressing is we need to be smart enough to lay out that contextual language like you did in space policy that lays down the fabric of security trust, cybersecurity trust, privacy trust, collaboration happens at that speed of trust. And so that's really interesting to me. And I hope you guys are listening carefully, because I think Scott is a great government policy person and experienced in doing it.